Today I'm joined by Julia Mims, who's our pediatric team lead, and we are very excited to have this conversation today with Julie Matthews because she is somebody that we have both learned from over the years, and we're excited to chat with her about her new book. For those of you who don't know, Julie Matthews is a certified nutrition consultant who received her master's degree in medical nutrition with distinction from Arizona State University. She is a published nutrition researcher on the efficacy of therapeutic diets and nutrition interventions for autism spectrum disorder. Her work over 20 years has focused on complex neurological conditions, particularly autism spectrum disorders and ADHD, and she is the author of the award-winning book, Nourishing Hope for Autism, as well as her new book, The Personalized Autism Nutrition Plan, which we're going to be talking about in depth today. So thank you so much for being here, Julie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, super excited. Well, let's jump right in. I know Julia has a question for you right away.
All right.
Okay, so we have both read through your book, of course, before having this conversation. So I've pulled lots of little bits and pieces that I just thought were so insightful and really relevant to the work that we do in our practice as well. So, one of the first things that you mentioned in the introduction of this book was really about how the conversation and language around autism recently has been a bit divided on how or even if we should approach supporting children with autism from a functional perspective. And some argue that this is kind of a lack of acceptance of neurodiversity, but you mentioned that we are really trying to relieve suffering for a lot of these children. And we totally could not agree more with that statement. You gave a couple of specific examples of situations where children with autism are really struggling with the day-to-day function. And there's so much that we can do to support families in helping improve the quality of life for their children, from nutrition to microbiome support to detoxification efforts. So what would you say to parents who might be stepping into more of the functional work with their children and maybe just feeling that tension of not necessarily wanting to change their child, but also they see their struggles, right? And they want to help support them as much as possible. What would you say to those parents?
Mm. Well, I think that is a common experience. And, we all want our kids to be as happy and healthy as possible. I think that sometimes the conversation, as you said, gets a little derailed that, we're trying to change people or something. No, I'm here to support everybody and whatever neurodiversity they're bringing forward in the world. It is great, wonderful, fine. Nobody's trying to change that. But what I think a lot of people don't realize in autism, especially the more severe forms of autism, can be a lot of physical distress, emotional distress, anxiety, irritability, difficulty focusing. Maybe it's language, maybe it's GI distress. I had one family that I worked with, he was a teenager still in diapers because he had such serious GI distress. And so this is what I'm always looking to do, is how can I help improve some of the symptoms, whether they're core symptoms of autism or what I would call comorbid conditions. That's really what I'm looking for. And people will say, oh, well, diarrhea has nothing to do with autism. Well, they either say has nothing to do with it, or they'll say it's just autism, which both can't really be true. It's whatever's underlying their system is affecting them and can be affecting their body, or it could be affecting their brain. So I'm always looking at, well, what are those underlying factors and how can we improve those through the use of diet and nutrition in order to help them be healthier and happier and, just have a better quality of life and let their true gifts shine.
Absolutely. And, I think we're all seeing in pediatric practice that there's huge rises in autism diagnoses, as well as neurological concerns. And oftentimes there's behavioral concerns, even if there isn't a diagnosis. And we know that the rates of autism are increasing to be 1 in every 36 children. But you actually cited a study that had suggested that 40% of diagnoses are not attributed to the change in the diagnostic criteria. And it's actually a whole body disorder. which is really what we see as well. So I'd love if you could expand on some of the more contributing factors that you see in practice that might be little red flags for parents who are listening.
Yes. Well, you can't have a genetic epidemic. So people are trying to look for like, oh, is there a genetic factor or something? Well, that's not really how things work. That has to be something that triggers a huge rise because genetics don't change that quickly. And so then it becomes, well, what could be underlying the condition? Maybe genetics is one piece of it. But probably combine with certain environmental aspects. So I like to think of it as a combination of genetic predisposition and environmental assaults that triggers somebody into some sort of neurodevelopmental delay or neuroinflammatory condition or something like that. So that's how I think of it.
Absolutely. And I think we see, to your point, a lot of gastrointestinal distress that's
Mm-hmm.
contributing.
Mm-hmm.
Even, differences in the microbiome, poor detoxification. And ultimately, we're really just thinking about inflammation as a whole and then how that relates to neurological function as well.
Yes, I mean, inflammation is huge in any chronic condition. And it's no different in autism. Brain inflammation is a big one, but we see gut inflammation, a lot of oxidative stress. You're asking for some of the kind of underlying contributing factors. Mitochondrial dysfunction. Mitochondria help us create energy and kind of they're kind of the powerhouse of the cell to make that energy that we need, and that can also come with its own oxidative stress depending on how efficiently we can do that. You mentioned the gut, the microbiome, all of that important info. I mean, detoxification is big because all of the food additives have to be detoxified somehow, so they're a factor in this. And then just like you said, inflammation involves the immune system. So what how does the immune system see the foods that we're bringing in? Do they see them as friendly or do they see them as an invader? And so food allergies, food sensitivities, things like that. So there's a lot of different ways that foods can be stressors on the body. Not food itself, but certain food compounds can aggravate these underlying systems or not be able to be processed by systems that are not fully in the best shape.
Absolutely. And I think we see that really frequently too. And I think a lot of times, it is going back to some of those deeper pieces of detoxification and gut health. And oftentimes I've also seen that, you know, children can sometimes gravitate towards the foods that they are most sensitive to as well.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting consideration, I think, when it comes to autism spectrum as well. And we do have some questions about more of like that very specific picky eating as well, but just kind of circling back to what you were saying about genetics and detoxification. So, we understand that autism is not caused by a single gene mutation or anything like that, but there are many genetic variants that are often seen in autism. So,
Yes.
just thinking through like how can we support children long term? How important do you think it is to know certain genetic SNPs for a particular child in supporting them long term? Or can you kind of assume certain factors are possible and you're going to address those issues in similar ways, no matter the
Mm,
you mentioned like sulfation, methylation, those types of.
yes. Yeah. Good question. I mean, I think a lot of times for me, like whether you know that information or do various testing is, are you going to do something with that information? And so if it's things like, I always think more data is good. So sure, of course, finding out how their methylation is working and all of that is great. And then knowing exactly how to target supplementation. I mean, that is the point of my book, The Personalized Autism Nutrition Plan. However, with that said, sometimes simple getting folate in normal, everyday, recommended daily allowance. That sometimes is enough for the system. Although they could have something more significant where they've got cerebral folate deficiency and then maybe they need more or something. So I think sometimes we can So I have my, with my 12-step plan, sometimes I was going to say, sometimes we can start with the basics, right? We can start with the multivitamin mineral formula that will cover a lot of those basic things. But then if we need more or something different, that's often where the testing, I think, can come in handy to figure out what somebody really needs. So is it required that you do genetics in order to help your child? Absolutely not. But could it be a helpful piece of the puzzle for personalized nutrition? Yeah, it can be, especially depending on the person and what is a factor for them. So if they happen to have one of those factors, that might be more important for them. So I do think that there is a place for all of that. And I think that's where you want to just decide, do you want to start at just the beginning steps and do some of the kind of generally beneficial principles for most people that I think are just good basic nutritional principles? Or do you want to start getting a little more, I was going to say fancy, sophisticated, whatever you want to call it, with some of the more customized pieces?
I totally agree with that. We have a lot of children who have either, an autism or ADHD diagnosis, or just have more of like the behavioral signs and symptoms or neurological signs and symptoms. And everybody's kind of on this spectrum, if you will, of where they are in that journey. We have a
Mm-hmm.
lot of kids who really are, limited to 5 foods, and they're at a totally different starting point than those who have already kind of covered the bases in those foundations.
Definitely, definitely. That's why it's a little hard to do personalized nutrition in a book, because you're speaking to a very big general audience, but you're getting specific and personal for each person. So there are a lot of different pieces of that puzzle. And so that's why I really kind of laid it out with the easiest things to do first that help the most people, and then get more and more specific, depending on what it is that somebody might need.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that nutrition is foundational for kids. And like Julia said, oftentimes they're coming in at different spots. So, we do have a lot of kids who come in and maybe due to toxicity in their body or imbalances in their gut, they don't tolerate a lot of foods,
Mm-hmm.
or they're extremely picky. So as
Mm.
much as we want to focus on them having high quality proteins and fats as the baseline for their diet, this is also a challenging thing that I think a lot of parents are really up against. So
Yes.
we're curious, what would you suggest for kids who are really picky eaters, or they just don't want to eat foods that are outside of those safe foods for them that might help move them in the right direction?
Yes. Well, so firstly, I think just parents being aware that you're not alone. So children with developmental delays, about 80% of them are picky eaters. And for kids on the autism spectrum, it's about 70% of them. So not just all of the conditions, 80% of them have, in one of these conditions, but inside of autism itself, it's a very large percentage. And the types of foods or the types of picky eating habits are very specific and unique to them. And they usually have more than one. They usually have several. So if firstly, I think it's like, if that's your child, be aware that it's usually not, quote, just behavioral. There's things going on. There's things that you can do. And yeah, there might be a component of that, but I don't like to think of it just as that. I like to think of it as a much more complex topic where we could look at, are there biochemical reasons for the picky eating? Are there anxiety reasons, or sensory sensitivity or something like that? And then how can we get creative? If it's sensory, there's a sensitivity there. What kinds of textures do they like? Do they like crispy and crunchy? They don't like chewy. They don't like maybe mixed textures. What is it they like? And try to focus on giving the foods that way. Because there's always a way to make things like vegetables in a texture. Is it pureed? Is it crunchy? Is it raw? Is it uh, blended in a smoothie? Is it blended in a pancake? Understanding what texture they like really can make a difference. And that's not just vegetables. Protein is another thing that I find sometimes can be a challenge. It all depends again on the child. I tend to find that kids tend to love dairy, and they tend to love carbs. And well, carbs is often wheat, right? So wheat and dairy. And if we look at why that might be, I mean, there could be a number of reasons, but one, from my perspective, is the biochemical reason of if you're not able to break down those two proteins, they actually can, if your digestion is weak or whatever it might be, they don't get broken down into all the individual amino acids. Instead, they get broken into these long chains. And unfortunately, this long chain can literally fit in the opiate receptor and mimic other opioid like compounds like heroin and morphine. So, what do we know about those? They're very addictive. So kids tend to gravitate towards them. And again, there's other reasons you might gravitate towards those foods, but that is one reason. And if your diet consists almost exclusively of that, probably a good clue that maybe there could be something going on there. And then knowing that there are ways to address it, or there's certain nutrient deficiencies that are common and cause picky eating. So I like to think about it from just a really multi-phased approach, working on their nutrients, the types of foods, the textures of foods, different things like that. I can't tell you the number of times where someone will tell me, oh, my child went gluten-free and dairy-free, and now all of a sudden they eat vegetables and they didn't before. I mean, that literally just happened on a call the other day. So anyway, lots, we could talk probably for hours on picky eating just because it's such an important topic and so common. But I think that might be a good start for people.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the idea of playing with textures and recognizing that food is more than just the item. I think we think of like broccoli is always broccoli, but that's not the case, right?
Right.
On that kind of note, I'm very curious your best tips for protein in particular. So, it's not uncommon that we see there are those biochemical processes that lean children away from wanting to eat protein, of course. But in terms of playing with texture, how do you think about protein?
Yes. So, I mean, just in general for parents, protein is really important I think many of us know it's important for growth, but it's also important for repair. So if you have a gut that's, inflamed and not doing well, or you need to build digestive enzymes or neurotransmitters for the brain, all of those require protein or the amino acids that come from protein. And so that's where getting enough protein, I think, is important. And uh, some kids do fine with this, but sometimes it can be a challenge. And I think part of that reason is what you're bringing up here, which is they can be really dry and chewy. So think about chicken breast can be so, I mean, if it's not cooked right, I don't even like chicken breast. It's just, you're chewing forever. Same thing, steak. Again, depending on the type cut of beef and how it's cooked, it can be really chewy. And if you have poor mitochondrial function, or you're just maybe just a kid, that can be too much work, and not enjoyable. Maybe the flavor or the texture. So, maybe there's a sauce that's added. Maybe it is, more slow simmered in a way that makes it more tender. Maybe it's in one of the recipes in my book is chicken pancakes, and that one is taking cooked chicken breast and eggs and blending them up in a food processor and then cooking them into pancakes. And it has a very similar pancake texture to it. So that's what I'm always looking at is how can we create a texture that's a little bit maybe softer. Again, it does depend, on the texture that maybe they like everything crispy and crunchy and you need to find a way to make a coating for it that's gluten-free or something. So those are the things I'm always looking at. And that's why I thought it was really important to include recipes because, if it can be a healthy food, but if kids aren't going to eat it, then it doesn't really do us any good.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely agree with that. I think, a lot of times we will see, you mentioned like the sensory differences among children. And so a lot of times we'll see, on one side of the aisle, we've got those like hypersensitivities, like not okay with really most textures. And then we also see the others where, they're not getting that adequate like communication to the brain from their gut or even from
Mm-hmm.
their mouths of like, I am eating and now I am full. And so we have that more sensory seeking approach where like it doesn't matter the texture, it's just going to
Mm-hmm.
get shoveled and swallowed quickly. And, either side of those things can definitely, lend itself to that gut dysfunction and that digestive incapacity that you're mentioning with like gluten and dairy, but also so many other types of foods. And we can see dysfunction either way.
Mm-hmm.
Those parents of the more picky, strict eaters who have a few safe foods who maybe they're more concerned on, their nutrient status and they're afraid of kind of pulling, entire food groups because that's the ones their children rely on. And so those I find can be the more tricky situations where, a parent is already concerned whether their child's overweight or their diet is just so, so limited. So what would you
Mm-hmm.
say to those parents who have the more extremely picky children?
Well, are you referring to the ones that are just kind of eating a lot and that kind of version of things, or are you talking about the picky eaters that don't eat as much quantity?
I would say I've seen the concern from more of the parents of picky eaters who are not eating a lot at all, or
Yes,
not a
yes,
lot of variety even. Maybe they're just eating processed foods.
yes, yes. I mean, I think that it's a bit of a process, and I think that kind of figuring out, well, if you can figure out what's behind it. So if you start to get a sense, oh, they only eat certain textures, that might be a clue and help you figure out how you can make the foods in a texture that they like. If you're finding out that they um, maybe don't like certain flavors, right? They only like that sort of sweet flavor or something like that. Like, I mean, I'd like them to eat something other than sugar, but could you put a sauce on it that has some fresh mango, puree or something in it, or salad. I have this great salad dressing that I love that's like a little apple cider vinegar and honey. So the honey gives it that sweetness, which actually is a good prebiotic, along with the probiotics and things in the apple cider vinegar. And it's sweet and it's good. So it adds to that. And you can add a little bit of maybe fruit into the salad. Like, again, all depends on what they like and don't like. But so figuring out if it's a flavor thing, if it's a texture thing, um, is it the way it's presented? Is it a visual presentation? And just trying to kind of figure out how to support them best in presenting that food while you're working on what might be underlying the picky eating. I've seen gut microbiome influence picky eating. I've seen, as I said, gluten and dairy or other foods. I've seen food additives influence picky eating. So again, in addition to kind of work on what might be underlying some of that, also working on being creative in the forms of how you're presenting the food.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. It's like a whole sensory experience, and one particular thing might be the kicker where a child doesn't feel this like safety around the eating environment, right? And so
Yes.
it's definitely something that we, discuss with families of children on the spectrum, is the importance of creating like a really safe environment, right? But,
Yes.
to your point too, we can definitely see this kind of cyclical relationship where it's like we've got this picky eating, we need them to get more nourished. We might have some digestive incapacity and some
Mm-hmm.
nutrient deficiencies, and they're all kind of part of the same pie there. So, thinking about supplementation, especially long term, you mentioned kind of your top three being more like your targeted multi nutrient supports, your essential fatty acids, and your digestive enzymes, which definitely agree. Those are such great, like core long term support for situations like this for children. So are there any other like non-negotiables or critical supports or nutrients you found to be helpful for children with autism or even similar concerns like ADHD or other developmental
Mm-hmm.
disorders?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think the three you mentioned are some of the foundations in that obviously multivitamin minerals give you a broad range of a whole bunch just to meet their daily needs. And a fatty acid blend is going to be really important and helpful for the brain and cellular function, all of that. The digestive enzyme may not be a long-term thing. It might just be something they need while they're working on their digestion or while they're working on changing their diet or, something like that. So don't necessarily consider that necessarily depend a long-term thing. It'll depend on them. Any non-negotiables. I mean, I would say everything else is personalized. Once you get all of your basic essentials, I guess another essential would be essential amino acids, right? We need to get those. And that I like to look for from food, like protein, which is why I mentioned good quality food. So from that perspective, I would say, starting with a good healthy diet would be a great thing. That way they can get enough protein. And I do talk about, I don't know how much protein your child might need, how to calculate that protein. So parents can get a sense. One of the most common questions I get from parents, either that I work with as clients or in my program, is how much protein does my child need? And so, I give examples of that for them so they get an idea. So I would say that rather than, there might be times someone needs targeted amino acids, but to me, those would be more of a personalized thing. But all of us need just regular essential amino acids that we would get from our food, ideally from animal protein, or we want to be very specific in our plant-based protein to really make sure that we are getting all of those essential amino acids in the right amounts with that. Yeah. And then, I would say from there, again, like vitamin D is important. And depending on where you live, you might need more vitamin D supplementation than somewhere else. But that's where some of that personalized support comes in. That's where someone like your, healthcare team can figure out, should you do testing or should you stick with more of the basic RDA or that kind of thing?
Perfect. So we do a lot of work around gut health, which has huge impacts on other areas of the body, especially as we think about the immune system and the ability to detox. And you mentioned that supports like methylated B vitamins, sulforaphane, and glutathione can be helpful. And we completely agree. We use that a lot. And one of the things we see happens is it tends to go one of two ways for children. They either tolerate them very well, so that we see increased attentiveness, focus, and it supports communication, or we see that they have more irritability and aggression and they lose focus. And we're curious if you have seen this same variability and what you're thinking about as contributing factors for these type of responses.
So you said sulforaphane, glutathione, and what was the other one?
Methylated Bs.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that I would guess it's the methylate. Well, the methylated Bs would be my first suspect. Yes, any supplement people can have a difficult time processing for a variety of reasons. Could there be a flavoring in it? Could it just be too much for what their system can handle? That kind of thing. So, but bees can be a little tricky, I think, which is why sometimes in a multi, you'll have less of those than if you did like a B complex or something. That's why starting, I think, with a multi can help. Now, if they react to a multi-vitamin mineral formula, then I might go one by one because sometimes it's the form of a nutrient. So sometimes people don't do well with a certain form of folate or a certain form of B12. Maybe the extra methyl donors are too much for them and they need something a little bit, earlier in the pathway. Maybe it's a certain amount of it might be too much for them. That would be so, and in that case, I have seen that. It seems counterintuitive since these are so good, they're so important, all that stuff. But it could be just going too quickly for their capacity. They need more time to get used to those amounts. Or like I said, it could be the form, or maybe they just don't ever need that much, or, whatever. That much depends on what kind of supplement they're doing, right? If they're doing just, the basic RDA, then that might not be the same. But some of these supplements have a lot more. And sometimes that works great for people, but sometimes it's just the wrong combination of things for them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And even just for example, we have one client who was recommended prior to working with us that they use glutathione to support detoxification efforts. They had a mold exposure, knew that was part of his picture. And as part of doing the glutathione supplementation, the little boy started talking more and they saw huge developments in speech, but at the same time, we're seeing changes in hyperactivity or losing focus and like being a little bit more aggressive, particularly at school, and just seeing how those two things are connected and maybe just moving a little too fast.
Mm, yes, it all any of those things could be, could be possible, and sometimes things could, yeah. Even too much of a good thing can be a challenge, and sometimes it's hard to know exactly why that is. There could be multiple factors. Even improving the gut microbiome can too quickly can be a quote negative, or not a negative, can have some reactive symptoms and things like that, because even getting rid of the bad guys too fast can flare up a whole bunch of toxins and other things like that. So it's always a kind of a little balance of what works best for the person and how quickly or slowly they need to go. Or again, maybe it's not the right thing for them. Maybe they've got, I don't know, some block in some enzyme, or it's pushing a different pathway or something like that. So it is kind of a complicated thing. That's why I wouldn't say that there's things that everybody needs that are, but yeah, I would say that depending on what someone's presenting to me, those things would be the crucial things for that person rather than across the board.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think, these are the clients that we do want to move much slower with. They generally have, more poor detoxification pathways, maybe even some toxicity buildup of XYZ. And so we want to be sensitive to that and just kind of take it at their pace, their body's pace, which might look different than another child. And that's okay, right? But we can still
Yes.
support them in that way. And then just kind of speaking to that as well, like getting a little bit further into like the functional work. You have this awesome chapter at the end of the book titled Beyond Diet and Nutrition. You mentioned several other things that may be kind of co-occurring for children with autism. And
Mm-hmm.
in our practice, we do see many of these issues kind of across the board with our pediatric clients, particularly things like gut dysbiosis, mold toxicity, even mast cell activation. And so we know that toxins like mold or mycotoxins, like ochratoxin A being one of them, they've been shown to not only inhibit like that cellular and mitochondria dysfunction you were mentioning, but also, of course, the brain and neurological function, the immune system, the detoxification organs, and then just kind of coinciding with some of that gut dysbiosis. They're often co-occurring. We see a lot of candida in the GI tract with those types of toxicity exposures as well. And you mentioned that as being a really
Mm-hmm.
common gut pathogen amongst
Mm-hmm.
children with autism. So, of course, we can't bypass the foundation of nutrition. Like you said, that is just kind of that stepwise approach. We have to make sure that that diet is nutrient dense, free from a toxin load in that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we have seen that, for that neurodevelopment, for that behavior, that toxin load can be a massive challenge, right? So, what are your thoughts on how often it's necessary to go kind of beyond the foundation of nutrition and utilize things like further testing and functional work for autism?
I mean, I would say always. I mean, I feel like, I'm not claiming that nutrition is the thing that is going to solve everybody's autism problem. And, um, I think it's a foundational piece that would be a great or important or even maybe essential piece of the puzzle. But there's other components to it. And the microbiome is a big one. And toxins are a big one as well. And so I always encourage my clients and families to work with a good functional medicine doctor, a good, integrative health practitioner that can really look and see, are there other things that are factors that could be influencing their child or affecting their child from getting better, kind of inhibiting some of that healing, or something that could take it to the next level. Or, if you think like we've got mold, um, that's just constantly depleting antioxidants and other important nutrients, because you just got to use those for the fire that's in front of you. Whereas if you can address that, now you can use the nutrients for the growth and the repair and all of that good stuff. Same thing goes with mast cell activation, which is another very inflammatory process that is going to utilize our nutrients. And then, of course, the microbiome can affect many different foods that we maybe cannot tolerate, whether it's FODMAPs or grains or starches or salicylates or whatever it might be. We didn't really get into all of those, but the microbiome can affect our ability, oxalate can affect our ability to process, utilize, break down, react to very healthy foods if we're not aware of maybe the biochemical process that's underlying it. And so if we're always depleting the system because we've got some factor in there that's causing that depletion, then we don't have those nutrients for the important things. And we might actually be reacting to all sorts of foods like grapes and berries and spices and all sorts of healthy food. But for our child, it's actually causing a challenge for them. And it's not really giving the desired benefit.
Perfect. And the other side of this too is we loved how much you weaved into the whole book how important it is for parents to take care of themselves, because as you know, it's so easy to put yourself on the back burner as a parent.
Yes.
Can you explain why this is so important and how this ultimately impacts the outcomes for children as well?
Yes. Well, I mean, you're right. Like, as a mom, I can tell you it's taken me 15 years to prioritize this. But if we don't have the energy, if we don't get enough sleep, or we don't have the energy that we need in whatever capacity that is, then we don't, not only don't we not have the physical energy, but we don't have the emotional and psychological strength that we need just to be parents in general. And the more we can think clearly, the better decisions that we can make and all of that. I would also say that the more we learn about how to take care of ourselves, the more we can also take care of our kids. So if I need to use a sort of backdoor way of helping ourselves, is that these tools we can also use to help our kids. So anything that we can use to calm ourselves, calm our mind, calm our anxiety, nourish ourselves, whatever it is, these principles can also be helpful for our kids. They can be examples that our kids can see us doing, so that can help them see it's important for themselves. And also, kids are very empathetic, so they really pick up on our energy. So if we are not doing well, that can really rub off on them, and that can affect their mood and behavior and general health and anxiety and all that as well. So I think it's good for us, but it's also good for them.
Absolutely. I think it's one of the things that we often see. It's usually mom, if we're being honest, where mom has a lot going on and it ends up getting mirrored in children, especially younger children, but I don't think it ever truly stops. So I think, to your point, it is so important that they're learning how to manage stress and how to take care of themselves and modeling that behavior for their kids as well.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better.
Awesome. Is there anything else you wanted to ask, Julia?
Yeah, I think I was just kind of reflecting on what you were saying about like the nervous system and the stress and that relationship and that dynamic with family. And I can just personally attest to the challenges there. I absolutely agree. So much of, what kind of filters down to our children does come from like the matriarch of the home with the mom. And it can be, such a sensitive area when there's kind of this cyclical relationship between maybe, the behavior as just communication from the child and the way that mom is able to have the capacity to respond,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so much of that can feed off of one another, whether you have a child on the autism spectrum or not.
Mm-hmm.
There's just that relationship there that I think is really critical to kind of foster. And so much of that does come back to, are we nourished? Are we sleeping? Do we have
Mm-hmm.
this like buzzing kind of frequency situation going on? Like you mentioned in your book, the EMFs and that sort of thing,
Mm-hmm.
how much that can be very disruptive, especially to a child who's very sensitive. And you mentioned like the empathy there, like they're just more sensitive, more in tune often, I would say, with their bodies and
Mm-hmm.
either the comfort and safety or the discomfort and anxiety that they're experiencing. And so much of that does come out in those like behavioral communications, right? And so
Yes.
parents, it's like, how can we then, support our children by kind of, being that safe space for them? And that's really hard. That's really hard to do,
Mm-hmm.
when as an adult, like you are your own person and that sort of thing. Whereas as a child, it's like they're leaning on us for that safety and that like connection. And I think that's so important for quality of life, for them as well.
Yes. Yes. And we all, I mean, I know for myself, I'll speak for myself. Sometimes I think I'm doing a great job not showing it, but they can still sense it a lot of times. So, yeah, it's just again, we have so much to do. This is always about being positive and never, beating up moms that are having such a hard time holding everything together. It's okay. It's okay to have a bad day. It's okay to have a bad week or a bad month. Um, the better that we can be, the better that is for them. So if we just, I think it's just all about putting a focus on it. And anything that we can do, I think, is a positive thing to do. And then, just going from there.
Wonderful. Well, this has been lovely, Julie. We appreciate your time so much. Where can people find out more about you and get your book?
Yes, so they can go to the personalized autism nutrition plan. They can go just look up Julie Matthews Autism Nutrition on Amazon or any bookseller, and they can find the book. And they can also find me at the book title minus the. So personalized autism nutrition plan.com. They can find me. That's probably the easiest way. But yeah. If I can do anything to help, I'm happy to do so.
And thank you so much.
Thank you.